So you've introduced yourself to me. Probably my turn to do the same for you. This is my family, my wife and my 2 children, and those kids are they exhaust me in every possible way. I have a bachelor's in biblical studies from Life Pacific University. You notice my mask, LPU. That's Life Pacific University. I actually work for their extension campus in Christiansburg. So we have a small extension campus there that does a 2-year program. So I teach there. That's my full-time job. I also, like I mentioned, teach at Radford. Primarily teach Survey of World Religions at Radford, but also teach their New Testament class when it comes up. And I've taught a couple of other things there as well, but just in a part-time capacity. Married my wife in 2008. My son, John Marshall, was born in 2014. My son's named after my dad and my grandfather on my mom's side. And my daughter, Amelia Isley, is named after a character in Doctor Who, Amelia Pond, and Mos Eisley in Star Wars. And those were my wife's choice, not mine. So that tells you that I chose wisely with my wife, because she's fantastic. I have a master's in Christian thought from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where I focus mostly on patristics, which is the church fathers. So about half of my grad work was exegesis of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then the other half of my grad work was looking at 100 AD to 800 AD and reading Irenaeus and Athanasius and Origen and all those guys, right? So I'm a history nerd, right? Like that's kind of where my main emphasis is. And then I will probably eventually do a PhD because I'm a glutton for punishment and I just dole this out. I've tried to do a PhD a couple of times now, and like it just life always gets in the way and it doesn't work out. But it will probably happen soon. I don't know. We'll see. Just so you know who we're talking about as far as the authors of our text, N.T. Wright is probably the most prolific New Testament scholar in the world right now. In scholarship, there are tons of people that write books, write articles, all that kind of stuff. There are not very many people that in 100 years, they are being studied, right? Not a lot of people, like their work actually continues and becomes a topic of study. I will not be surprised at all if in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, there are people that are scholars of N.T. Wright. Because he's done that much work and has had that much of an impact on the field of New Testament studies. Whether you like him or you hate him, he is just a giant in the field. He's written over 70 books, and I have no idea how many articles. And he is just, he's a giant in the field. There's a big discussion that we will talk about in this course called The New Perspective on Paul, which has become just this huge debate about how you understand Paul and things like justification. And N.T. Wright is at the forefront of that debate. There's a guy named E.P. Sanders and James V.G. Gunn that kind of were ahead of Wright, but Wright is the person who really brought it into the forefront. Prior to him, it was really an academic conversation. And then Wright grabbed a hold of it, and he started having pastors talking about it. He started having Bible study leaders talk about it. And so he's just a giant in New Testament studies. Michael Bird is one of the funniest scholars in the world. That guy is hilarious. He's like the Austin Powers of New Testament studies. He's Australian, and he was in the military for a long time, jumping out of planes and doing all sorts of crazy stuff like that. And then decided he got saved, and then decided he wanted to become a scholar. For a little while, he was going to become a minister, and then decided that his skills were more academic than they were ministerial. And so in his short career, which has actually been pretty short so far, he's a pretty young guy, he has written or edited over 30 books. He is really just, he's put out an insane amount of work. And on a broad scope of topics, he's kind of crazy. And so Bird is, this book really, honestly, is Michael Bird summarizing N.T. Wright's career. That's basically what this book is. N.T. Wright has done just an insane amount of stuff with the New Testament, and Michael Bird was tasked with summarizing all of that into one book. And so that's how this book is N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. They didn't really sit down and write it out necessarily as much as Wright had all of this stuff, and Bird sort of condensed it for the rest of us, right? N.T. Wright's Paul and the Faithfulness of God, for instance, is 2 volumes, it's 1,700 pages. And it's just ridiculous. Like, who writes 1,700 pages on one topic? It's just insane, right? And that's just one of his books, 2 volumes. And so Bird has summarized all of that for us so that we don't have to read everything that N.T. Wright has written, and so we thank him. One day when I do a PhD, it might actually be with Michael Bird. I've spoken with him at length about what I'd like to study, and he's agreed with my research proposal. It's just a matter of whether or not I can find time to actually enroll in the PhD and do the research. But he saw my research proposal and was like, I like this, you should do this here. And I don't know, we'll see how that goes. So he's a good dude though, really good dude, I like him. More theological reflection on what is the afterlife, how would they have understood the afterlife, what are they trying to say in the text when they're talking about the afterlife, like what does all that work out to? And then we have Paul and the faithfulness of God, and that's where we dive into what does Paul think about this stuff. Notice there on 11:26 we have Thanksgiving, and then after we do Galatians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we go to winter break. So just note, in this class on the New Testament, we're going to spend almost the entire fall semester preparing to read the New Testament. And then in December, we'll do Galatians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and done, right? So there's a lot of background material to cover before we get to the New Testament. Then after winter break, Paul and the faithfulness of God continued. We'll go through the rest of Paul's letters. Gospels and the story of God, obviously talking about the Gospels. Early Christians and the mission of God. So we'll be talking about the other letters that aren't Paul. In the making of the New Testament, we'll talk about textual criticism and canonization. We're actually going to talk about textual criticism and canonization a little bit tonight, just because it's probably going to be something that you're going to be curious about, and I don't want you to have to wait an entire year to get to it. So we'll talk about it a little bit tonight, but we will talk about it in more detail later, and then living the story of the New Testament, bringing it all together at the very end there. So that is like the big picture of getting through this entire book in an academic year. There are 37 chapters, and it's just a lot of material. So, yeah. Any questions on how that's all laid out? Or any of that? We're good? Okay. It's a lot, but, one bit at a time, right? So today's goal, what is the New Testament? Why should we study it? And we'll talk a little bit about canonicity, textual criticism, and then if we have time, translation. I tend to try to over-prepare so that way I don't run out of material, which means that I don't always cover everything I want to cover, right? So I may skip some slides so that we can get through here, because I would like to get to translation just because that's another question that you're probably going to have, like which translation should I read, which one's best, and all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So briefly, the New Testament, on the simplest level, second section of the Christian Bible, first section being what's called the Old Testament, or in scholarship, the Hebrew Bible. So this would be one of those places where Ehrman is not going to refer to it as the Old Testament, right? Because in academic literature, if you say the Old Testament, you're privileging Christianity over Judaism. Because Old Testament assumes that there's a New Testament, right? And so in scholarship, you say either the First Testament or you say the Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament. Whereas in Christian contexts, it's pretty common to say Old Testament, right? So, second section of the Christian Bible, 27 books, all of them are written in Greek, with very few little tiny exceptions where Mark will say, and Jesus said, Talitha cum, which is translated, little girl get up, right? So you have little tidbits of other languages in there, but primarily it's in Greek. Our background here is in Greek as well. Those are capital letters in Greek. An interesting thing about Greek, just to note it because it's there already, this is a manuscript, and so these are full words, except for where you see this line, right? So when you see this line, what that is that's called a nomina sacra. And a nomina sacra in Latin means sacred name or holy name. And so, for instance, that top center one, the line is over the chi rho, and the chi rho is a symbol of Christos, which is the Greek word for Christ, And so instead of spelling out one of the divine names, they put two letters beside each other and then put a line over it. So this is an early Christian attempt to respect the name of God, right? Because you have these traditions of, don't take the Lord's name in vain, right, from the Old Testament, from the Ten Commandments. And this is an attempt of that in the New Testament in early texts. And so since that's there, I figured we can note it. All of the New Testament is written between 50 and 120 CE or AD. There'd be another difference. Ehrman is always going to say CE without exceptions. Other people might accidentally say AD because, we're used to it. So Ehrman might also put some of the books a little after 120, and Bird and Wright would probably put all of the books before 100. But Ehrman isn't going to put them super late. Not super, super late. But he doesn't believe the traditional authors are the authors. But we'll get to that when we get to those books. 15 or 16 different authors, depending on your take on some of the authorship. We have 4 Gospels, Acts as history, 21 epistles, and then an Apocalypse. Right? So the Apocalypse is Revelation. Epistles are Pauline and otherwise, and then Acts and the Gospels. So at the simplest level, that's what we have. So here's some dates to give you an idea of what kind of when some of the New Testament was written. Galatians is probably written really early on. Maybe the first thing written in the New Testament. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians pretty early as well. James pretty early as well. 1 Corinthians pretty early. Mark is also pretty early. And then the first, after that, Luke and Acts probably. After that, we start to get, later, closer to 100 AD. One of the main ways that we date this, or at least from a conservative side, Ehrman would disagree here, but from a conservative side, one of the ways we date this is, anybody know a significant event that happened in 70 AD? Yeah, Jerusalem falls, specifically the temple. The temple's destroyed, right? And so if the temple's destroyed and they're writing about Jerusalem and writing about the temple, and they don't talk about it being destroyed, like, you would think if it was after 70 AD, they would probably mention, like, oh, and by the way, that got destroyed, right? And so one of the ways that we, when we look at Luke or something like that, we're like, yeah, it probably seems like this is before the destruction of the temple. Now, obviously, that gets debated, and Ehrman says they don't have it in there because it doesn't bear on what they're trying to do, and yada, yada, yada. But that's one of the ways that we think about dating it. There's other stuff as well. Times that they mention people that we know when that person was in that city and stuff like that, and that's helpful. Probably the earliest thing in the entire New Testament, and we will talk about this with historical Jesus when we get there, is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's talking about the resurrection, he says, I gave to you that which I received. And then he gives us something that sounds kind of like a formula, kind of like a creed. Most New Testament scholars across a bunch of different faith backgrounds agree that that sort of creed probably goes back to within a year of the cross. And so that little bit in 1 Corinthians 15 is probably the earliest thing that exists in the entire New Testament. And it's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. So that's kind of a big deal. 3 things that we're going to be talking about next time. Kind of a more big picture approach to what the New Testament is. The New Testament is history. We will have to talk about what we mean by that, because their definition of history is not the same thing as our definition of history. We have different standards for what is historically reliable than they did. Then the New Testament is literature. Ehrman is going to lean pretty heavily on that. It's literature. And then the New Testament is theology. And that's going to be, like Mike said, one of the things that Mike Bird and N.T. Wright are going to pull out in this book that Ehrman would not. Ehrman is not interested in theology whatsoever. Wright and Bird are definitely interested in theology. They write both biblical scholarship and theological scholarship. They sort of bridge that gap. And so we'll talk about those 3 things next week. Chapter 2, 3, and 4 cover these 3 things. The New Testament is history, the New Testament is literature, the New Testament as theology. So why study the New Testament? Why does this even matter? Why should we do this? This is the question I get all of the time in college classes, right? Like, why? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? That sort of thing. I teach a class at the Bible College in Christiansburg called Christian History and Theology. History and theology are two things that people tend to not like, and so when you put them together, you get a lot of complaints, right? And so all of my students are like, I don't want to do either of those things, let alone both at the same time, right? And so why do we do this, right? Well, with the New Testament, as Christians, right, the New Testament gives us what N.T. Wright refers to as the climax of the covenant, right? Everything is moving towards Jesus, right? So we should try to understand the New Testament as best we can because everything is moving in his direction. The New Testament's meant for everyone. It's written to everyone. Some books are written more to everyone than others. Like Luke's Gospel is written for everyone. Matthew's written specifically to Jews, but Matthew would still want other people to read his Gospel. He's just trying to persuade Jews. The New Testament explains the story of what God has done through Jesus to restore creation and renew the covenant. So again, we have this climax. Everything is building towards it. Paul says that the law in Galatians, he says the law is the tutor guiding us to Christ, right? And so the Old Testament is moving in the direction of Jesus. And you're only going to understand Jesus in light of the Old Testament. You're only going to understand the Old Testament in light of Jesus, right? So everything is driving in that direction. The New Testament invites and draws readers into lives of worship and mission. As Christians, we should study the New Testament because, well, it's central to our faith, right? If you're following Jesus, it's kind of hard to follow him if you don't know anything about him, right? So we should study the New Testament because in the New Testament, he speaks to us. But on the other side of things, this is Ehrman, right? Why does Ehrman think we should study the New Testament? Ehrman says Christianity has had the single greatest impact on Western civilization of any religion, ideology, or worldview, whether looked at culturally, socially, politically, or economically. There's no other institution that can even come close, and at the foundation of Christianity stands the New Testament. If one does not understand the New Testament, one cannot fully understand the course of the history of the world that we inhabit. And so Ehrman, even not as a believer, is saying everyone should study the New Testament because the New Testament is at the foundation of Christianity, and Christianity has shaped Western history more than anything else in the world. Right? So that's his perspective. And he's right. Right? Like Christianity has had a disproportionate impact on the world. So we should study the New Testament. Right? Development of the canon. This is Ehrman's take on the development of the canon. We have independent writings, books of the New Testament embody different points of view. He's going to emphasize the diversity of the New Testament, right? Like he says, we should not assume these authors all share the same perspective. And there's a point, there's like a sense in which that's true, right? Because we want to let people speak for themselves. But also, if there is a way that we can understand them in agreement with one another, we probably should do that. Like for instance, probably the easiest one to point out is people tend to say that James and Paul disagree with each other. Paul says that you're saved apart from works. James says, no, show me your works, right? Well, if there's a way to reconcile those two things, we probably should try to do that. Ehrman would say, no, don't reconcile them. They're saying different things. They disagree, right?
How does he speak to the gospel writers building on one another?
So he would agree with that, right? He would agree that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, specifically the synoptics, build off of one another. But he would also point out where where Matthew seems to change Mark, or where Luke seems to change Matthew. And so he would say, yeah, they work off of each other, but they disagree, right? Like, look at Peter's denial of Christ. It happens two different ways, right? And so he would push on the diversity there, even where there seems to be some working together, right? And again, we'll talk more about those differences when we get to the Gospels, because that bears on what our definition of history is, right? We tend to, in more recent years, recent speaking like last couple hundred years, so, recent historically, we tend to think of history as like cold hard facts, right? Here, what happened, right? But if you look at the ancient world, you take like Plutarch, for instance. Plutarch writes multiple biographies, and in those biographies, he'll tell the same story different ways, based on how he wants to emphasize what's happening in that particular biography, right? And that's what the New Testament authors are doing. That's what the gospel writers are doing. And so Ehrman is going to try to push on that diversity and try to say, you shouldn't trust this, you shouldn't believe this. We can't trust this, and it's. I mean, there are places where it's like, okay, there's differences there, and we need to think about that, but they're not sufficient to really follow him, I don't think, as far as he goes, at least. But we should. I mean, like I said, to a certain extent, we should say maybe the authors of the New Testament do disagree. Like, let's take an honest look at it, right? Do they disagree? Like, let's try to understand what they're saying, see where they're taking us, and if there's a way to harmonize that isn't insane, then, let's do that. But, let's go where the evidence takes us, right? Some of the main things that took us towards a development of the canon, these are some historical characters. Marcion, one of the first heretics, rejects books of the Hebrew Bible because he thinks that the God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. That's one of his heresies. So his canon only has 10 books. When that happens, what happens in Christian history is you see that Christians don't have a definition for something until someone gets it wrong. And then they say, no, that's not how it works. And the people that they're correcting say, well, okay, how does it work? And the Christians are like, I don't know, I just know that's wrong. Right? We haven't defined that yet, right? And so when he says, yeah, we're only going to use these 10 books, all the Christians are like, no. And he's like, yeah, but I mean, how many books should we use? And they're like, I don't know, but not those, right? Like, and so then they have to start deciding, like, okay, like let's get some details here. Like, what does our canon look like? How do we shape that? And so we see Irenaeus writing from the south of France in Lyon in middle of the 2nd century. He quotes 25, a typo here. Oh, man. Quotes 25 of the 27 books of the New Testament, not 29. Here I am adding to the New Testament. And he alludes to a 26th once. And then Clement, writing from Alexandria in Egypt, a completely different part of the Mediterranean, quotes 24 of the 29. And then Tertullian, writing from Carthage in North Africa on the other side, right? So there's 3 different geographical regions here, quotes 25 of the 27. And so around the same time, we have 3 people who were in different parts of the Mediterranean, and they're all quoting a majority of the canon, right? And so what that tells us is that we have a pretty early agreement to the core of the canon. Now, Ehrman's going to argue with this, right? Ehrman's going to say we don't have the canon until the 4th century. And in a sense, he's right. We don't have the canon until the 4th century. But we have the core of the canon in the 2nd century. We have the Gospels and Paul's letters by the end of the 1st century, honestly, if we want to debate it. And so we have the core of the canon really, really early on. One of the things that gets brought up in this, and I'm just going to toss one of them out there, there's a million different examples, is all of the other Gospels, right? We don't have time to go into all of the other Gospels, but here's my favorite example of the other Gospels. They're not included because, well, quite frankly, most of the time they're crazy. So here's an example. Gospel of Thomas. This is Gospel of Thomas 1:14. And Gospel of Thomas, Simon Peter said to them, let Mary go away from us, for women are not worthy of life. Right? That's a life verse right there, right? That's like, yeah, I'm encouraged. And Jesus said, look, I will draw her in so as to make her male, so that she too may become a living male spirit, similar to you. But I say to you, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. That's just patently crazy, right? Like, so when people are like, yeah, well, the Gnostic Gospels, they got kept out of the canon. Well, they got kept out of the canon because they're crazy, right? Like, that doesn't look anything like anything we read in Scripture. That isn't to say there aren't difficult things in Scripture, but there's nothing like that, right? Again, we don't have time to go into the Gnostic Gospels in detail, but, there it is, right? Development of the Christian canon, and Ehrman mostly would agree with this, with the exception of, is it spiritually nourishing? But here's basically the agreed upon criteria. Who wrote it? It needs to be an apostle or a close association of an apostle. When was it written? It has to be early enough that we can say it was an apostle or a close association of an apostle. What does it say? So does it agree with sort of the received teaching from the apostles? Is it spiritually nourishing? This is kind of a weird one. This means, like, if you read it, do you find that your life is transformed? And the early church actually cared about that. They're like, it's fine to read other stuff, but we only want to accept in the canon the things that actually transform your life. And so, for instance, the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanon, depending on whether or not you're from a Catholic background, isn't spiritually nourishing. Athanasius in the 4th century says that. Says we have these books in the Bible, and then there's these other books that are useful, but they are not spiritually nourishing. You should read them, but they aren't going to change your life. The 66 books of the Bible will change your life, right? And then is it quoted by church leaders? One of the things that, when we get into text criticism, which is the next slide, talking about how do we know what the New Testament says, how do we know what the Old Testament says as far as like the manuscripts that we have. There are so many quotations of the New Testament. The guy that Ehrman studied under for his PhD, a guy named Bruce Metzger at Princeton Theological Seminary. Bruce Metzger is probably in the last 200, 300 years, best textual critic of the New Testament. He is just like the gold standard. And Ehrman studied under him. And Metzger said, if we deleted the New Testament entirely, just got rid of every single copy of the New Testament, we could reconstruct over 90% of it just from quotations from the church fathers. So if we just took quotations from the first 400 years of the church, 500 years of the church, we could reconstruct almost the entire New Testament just from quotations. And so, is it quoted, right? Do we have Irenaeus, Clement, do we have these guys quoting it? If it isn't being quoted by them, we probably shouldn't consider it to be canonical. Right? So that's the development of the canon in very short form. Like I said, we'll come back to the development of the canon towards the end of the class, but I just wanted to give you kind of like a snapshot of it, just so that way as we move forward into the class, you are aware of what we're talking about. So textual criticism, these writings are circulated widely, and they are not copied professionally in a lot of instances. And so what this results in is basically a written version of the telephone game, right? You copy, and you don't necessarily get the copy right. An easy example of this is in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. It says, having therefore been justified by faith, we have peace with God. We have peace with God is one reading. There's a variant that says, let us have peace with God. The difference between we have peace with God and let us have peace with God is a homen and a homen. That is a very tiny change, like very tiny change. It's a short O and a long O, omicron and omega, right? And so if you are in a scriptorium where I'm reading the text and you're writing down what I say, you don't really necessarily have time to say, was that a homen or a homen? Right? Like, you just write down what you thought I said, and keep going. And so we get a lot of variants that way. A lot of variants in the New Testament. Not as many in the Old Testament, thankfully. Most people would not be able to afford a personal copy, let alone multiple writings. And circulation and copying of these letters led to degradation. And so early manuscripts are hard to find because mostly they've just broken apart by now. So when we find a really early manuscript, it tends to be about the size of a credit card because you just don't have a big piece of paper that has the Gospel of Mark on it from the first century. That just hasn't survived, right? And so we do have issues here. We do have issues with textual criticism. Here's Ehrman. Ehrman from one of his popular level works. You'll find that if you read Ehrman at the popular level versus reading Ehrman at the scholarly level, that there is a marked difference. At the scholarly level, he knows what he can't get away with, mostly. There's still some stuff that he says that I'm like, that was dishonest, or at least misleading. But at the popular level, he'll say stuff regularly that's just like, dude, come on, seriously? Right? Because it sells books. So he says, we don't actually have the original writings of the New Testament, which is true, right? We don't have the original Romans, we don't have the original John. What we have are copies of these writings made years later, in most cases many years later. Again, that's true. Moreover, none of these copies is completely accurate, since scribes who produced them inadvertently and or intentionally changed them in places. So he's going to push really hard on the fact that, hey, there's people that have a bias, and they know what they want the text to say, and so they're changing it to say what they want it to say. All scribes did this, right? It's a little bit historically ridiculous, because how would you even prove that? How would you prove 2,000 years ago people were making biased decisions in copying? Like, how would you even prove that? You don't even have the manuscripts to show that they changed them, right? So this is just pure fabrication. If you could demonstrate that here's a manuscript and then here's what they changed it to, okay, that's one thing. But you're literally telling us you don't have the first manuscript, so you can't demonstrate that they changed it. This is just unbelievable. So rather than actually having the inspired word of the autographs, which is the originals, the first version of the Bible, what we have are error-ridden copies of the autographs. So he says this on page 4 and 5 of Misquoting Jesus, which is a New York Times bestseller. If you look at the second edition of this, there is a Q&A after the index. And in the Q&A after the index, the person who asks him the questions says, you said that we have error-ridden copies, but I've read Metzger, your PhD supervisor, and he says we can trust the text of the New Testament. And Ehrman in the index, or in the Q&A after the index, right? How many people are reading that far, past the index, right? Says, well, yeah, none of the errors affect any central doctrine in Christianity. None of the variants have any bearing on a major doctrine of Christianity. And you're like, shouldn't you put that on page 4 and 5? Like, if you're going to say that we have error-ridden copies, shouldn't you say, and I mean, all of these errors, like, I mean, essentially they don't matter. But we have a lot of errors, guys, right? And so, in his popular level, I find him just very, very misleading, if not dishonest,
hey,
right?
Brian, it's also true that if you have an accessible version of the Greek New Testament, that almost all those variants are in the footnotes.
Yeah, the significant variants.
It's not hidden away. It's easy for you to see what those are.
Right.
You can examine for yourself what difference they make in the Greek text.
Yeah. I mean, you have all of the significant variants are listed there, not only with the variant reading, but it'll also tell you the major manuscripts that have that. And if you know what those major manuscripts are, you can even tell when that variant happened, where that variant happened. I mean, if you're really into textual criticism, you can do some real, like, investigative work with textual criticism. Like, you can say, you know, the reading that predominated in Alexandria was this, but the reading that predominated in France was this. Like, you can really get into the weeds with that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you want to know what the variants are, they're there for you. You just have to do the work, right? So that's a good point. I've got a couple of images here I'm not going to read through, but these are like, I just have these in the PowerPoint just as like examples of the Facebook version of textual criticism that you will often see. And this is David Cross, a comedian. He talks about how the Bible is written and rewritten and translated and retranslated and yada, yada, yada. And I get this from people all the time. I get this from people who say, how can you trust the text of the Bible after it's been translated so many times? Well, it's not as though the Bible was translated from Greek into Latin, and from Latin into German, and from German into French, and from French into English. That would be ridiculous, right? We probably have lost something in that, right? I mean, if you're not sure, take a sentence, go to Google Translate, and go through 5 or 6 different languages. It's going to get ridiculous. That's not what we have. We translate everything from Greek or everything from Hebrew, right? And so, like, all of this, like, retranslated, re-edited, it's nonsense, right? That's not what we do. And then here's another one that, talking about the manuscripts that we have and all this kind of stuff. And, I'm not going to go through the details of that. If you're interested in seeing those, they are in the PowerPoint that will be on the Google Classroom. But both of these are just examples of, like, the lazy textual criticism that you will get from sort of internet atheists that want to say you don't have the right Bible and stuff like that, right? These aren't legitimate critiques that we should pay much attention to. But for the sake of time, let's move on ahead. So we don't have the original copies. We talked about that. Scribes copy text by hand, and so we do have a lot of differences. But we have, at present, Mike Lacono wrote a book about why are there differences in the Gospels, I think in 2016. And as of 2016, we have 5,839 manuscripts. Greek manuscripts, I should say, for the New Testament. 5,839 Greek manuscripts as of 2016. So we probably have over 6,000 now. That's just Greek. We have over 10,000 Latin manuscripts, right? So we have a lot of manuscripts to do textual criticism with. Yeah?
What makes them a manuscript versus just a copy that,
So manuscript means that it's like old, right? Like we wouldn't have like.
Definition, right?
I'm sorry.
That's still is like 1,000 years old, or what is the definition of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume it. That's a good question. Probably like it'd have to be copied by hand. Probably materials involved, and then probably some measure of age. But I'm not sure what the cutoff will be. But a photocopy wouldn't count. I mean, maybe like we shoot ahead 500 years, photocopies might count as manuscripts, but within our lifetime, nobody would call a photocopy a manuscript. So any copy of the New Testament, copy of a text that's old, sorry to be vague, but textual criticism isn't my specific discipline, so I'm not sure what the cutoff will be. That's a good question, though. If you post that on the Google Classroom or email me, I'll see if I can run down a better answer for you. Yeah, that's a good question. So we have all these manuscripts, and some of them are 500 years after the New Testament, some of them are 800 years after the New Testament, But it's useful to have that train, right? It's useful to see the history of transmission to see what we have, right? Most differences between manuscripts are not important. Ancient scribes couldn't spell, usually, super well. Before we get to the important ones, just to point out, let me see how much, I got a little bit of time. Let me show you an example just to give you a visual. Because that whiteboard over there is good to write on, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So just to give you an example, a visual example. This is in Arche ein halagos. In the beginning was the Word. John 1:1, first part of John 1:1 in Greek. You can write this as halagos ein, or in Arche ein. And it means the exact same thing. Right? Because the way that grammar works in Greek is it's all based on a case system. If you ever taken Latin or Greek or any of those kinds of languages that work off of a case system, this phrase, halagos, the word, can be anywhere in the sentence, and it doesn't change the meaning. You know that that's the subject of the sentence based on what case it's in. So you can have variants where one manuscript says this, and the other manuscript says this. Well, that's technically a variant, but it means the same thing. You can also have a variant that says this. This still says the same thing, because you can remove the definite article in Greek without removing the meaning of definiteness. You would still translate this, in the beginning was the Word, even though the definite article is not there, even though ha has gone, right? So, there's a bunch of different ways to order things in Greek without actually changing the meaning, and a lot of the variants are that, right? And so, people get bent out of shape about how many variants we have, because we have hundreds of thousands of them, but a lot of them don't matter, right? A lot of them are just, there's a variant in Thessalonians where Paul says, when we were among you, we came to you as children. And children is nepioi in Greek. There's a variant there that says apioi instead of nepioi. You know what apioi means? Horses. And so there's a variant where Paul says, when we were among you, we came to you as horses. Is that a legitimate variant? No, they just lost the N, right? They lost the one letter, and obviously Paul isn't saying that he's a horse, right? And so there's variants where it just doesn't matter, and we shouldn't get bent out of shape about that. There are some variants that matter. The ending of Mark being one of the most famous ones. If you look at a study Bible, when you get to Mark 16:9, it should say, after this, most early manuscripts don't have this. So that's a variant. We have a lot of manuscripts that don't have the ending of Mark, and we're not sure why. We're not sure if the ending shouldn't be there, or if the early manuscripts, maybe the ending just crumbled off. I heard one scholar say that He thinks that the earliest versions of Mark were on a scroll. And so the part of the scroll that's most exposed to the elements is the end. And so that part just withered off on most of the copies of Mark. And so we just lost the ending, right? Now, I don't know that that's true. I'm not particularly persuaded by it, but it's also not patently false, right? And so we're not sure. Not sure about the ending of Mark. Woman taken in adultery, this is mostly John chapter 8. This isn't in the earliest manuscripts, so we're not sure if it should be there. It's a big variant. And then there's a phrase about the Trinity in 1 John 5:7, where it says there are three that bear witness in heaven, and these are the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And that phrase about the three that bear witness in heaven isn't in the original manuscripts. What probably happened here, I'll give you another visual aid really quick, just for the sake of understanding how this probably happened. If you have a manuscript and you are copying manuscripts, let's say that you have a manuscript and it says a bunch of stuff, right? You ever write in the margins of your Bible? They did too, right? So let's say you write something in the margin. And so it says, there are three that bear witness on earth. The fire, the water, and the blood, or something like that. I forget what the three are. And you're like, oh, three, that reminds me of the Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit. You write that in the margin. Well, what happens if the person copying that sees this as a correction, and they insert that in the text? And so there's nothing in the margin anymore. Because they think you made a mistake and you added this to the margin to put it into the text. This is what's called a gloss. And there are times where we can show, like, manuscript doesn't have it, manuscript has it in the margin, manuscript has it in the text of the manuscript, where someone just incorporated it into the text, right? That's probably what happened with 1 John 5:7. It's a marginal note that just gets incorporated into the text. So again, there's stuff like this that it's like, people get bent out of shape about it, but we just don't need to. It's not that important. We don't need to get upset about it. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys tracking with this? So, the discipline of textual criticism, what we've just discussed, tries to reconstruct what the New Testament authors originally wrote. We'll discuss textual criticism again towards the end of the course in a year. But like I said, I just want to give you a snapshot of it now. Okay? In our remaining minutes, I'm glad we got here. Glad we are getting to the finish line. I want to talk about translation, because one of the most common things the most common questions I get is, what translation of the Bible should I read? And so we're going to talk about this. Okay? There are difficulties in translation. Here's an example. It's hard to convey wordplay. So there's a proverb in Italian. I don't speak Italian, but this is a common proverb that people use to explain the difficulty of wordplay. And it's traditore, traditore. You see how these are pronounced virtually the same. They sound virtually the same, but they're spelled differently because it's two different words. So you have a wordplay going on between these two different words, right? It means translator, traitor. And so if you translate something, you're betraying it, right? Well, in Italian, you are equating those two words because they sound almost exactly the same. The moment you translate that phrase, you lose the wordplay, right? There's no way to translate that into another language to convey that wordplay. It just doesn't work, right? And so when we translate, there's wordplays that you just can't do it, right? An example of this in the New Testament is when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. He says to Nicodemus, the wind blows wherever it wishes. You don't see it, but you see its effects. So it is with those who are born of the Spirit of God. And we read that and we're like, okay, I kind of get what you're saying. In Greek, he says, the pneuma blows wherever it wishes. You don't see it, but you see its effects. So it is with those who are born of the pneuma of God. See, in Greek, he uses the same word because wind and spirit are the same word. There's just no way to translate that into English, right? In Greek, it's a play on words. In English, you just lose it, right? And so that's a difficulty in translation. Yeah.
Didn't Jesus speak Aramaic though?
Right, so Jesus probably spoke Aramaic or Hebrew, maybe a little bit of Greek. If he's talking to Nicodemus, he's almost certainly speaking Aramaic with Nicodemus. But with regard to John's gospel, John is giving us that interchange in Greek. I'm sorry? Yeah, I mean, if we're going to, when we get to the Gospels, we'll talk about epistema verba versus epistema vox, and that's like a real issue of like how much of what we see in Jesus is what Matthew is giving us of Jesus, and how much are we seeing of Jesus that's Jesus, right? And that's challenging because when you read the Sermon on the Mount, that's Matthew giving you the Sermon on the Mount in Greek. Jesus didn't give the Sermon on the Mount in Greek. He gave it in Aramaic. So, or maybe Hebrew, but not Greek. So, how much of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in Greek lines up with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Aramaic? That's a real issue in gospel studies and historical Jesus in general. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So, but that's a good question. Another one is euphemism. Euphemism is when you say something that's indelicate in a delicate way so that you don't offend sensibilities, right? The example that I've heard, there's a Greek professor named Bill Mounts. He uses this example. I don't know German, but according to Bill Mounts, he says, if you're speaking German, you have to say, "It is cold to me." You can't say, "It's cold," or "I'm cold." Because if you say, "I'm cold," you're saying, pardon me, I'm sexually frustrated. And the same thing with "I'm hot," right? You have to say, "It's hot to me," or "It's cold to me," right? Euphemisms don't translate. You know, there are other ways of saying things in languages where you're avoiding how to say the thing you don't want to say because you don't want to offend sensibilities, and that doesn't translate. Like, you just end up saying something weird, and everybody's like, "I don't know what that means." But in the original language, like, it made sense, right? Currency. This is a big one. This is a really big one. I'm not sure which way we should go with this. Do we use their measurements, like shekel or talent, or do we contextualize and use our equivalent? And here's the rub. If we contextualize and use our equivalent, how often do we readjust for inflation? Right? Like, if we say this is such and such amount of dollars, well, in 20 or 30 years, we got to adjust that, right? The NIV, the most popular NIV translation, was done in 1984. I'm pretty sure the dollar in 1984 and the dollar in 2020 aren't the same. So we'd have to make some adjustments there, right? So we have to figure out what to do there. Vocabulary, the range of meaning of hapto. This is an easy example of range of meaning. Hapto, if you have on your phone something called haptic feedback. Haptic feedback is when you touch it and your phone goes, you know, gives you a little vibrate to know that your finger touched it. Hapto is the Greek word for touch. But hapto can mean touch, grab, embrace, or have sex with. Well, it doesn't mean all of those all of the time, right? And it's worth noting that when Jesus heals the lepers, often it says he haptos them. So it's entirely possible, and I think likely, that when Jesus heals lepers, he embraces them. I mean, can you imagine being someone who's untouchable, and the person who heals you not only heals you, but hugs you, right? Can you imagine that first physical touch taking place with wholeness, right? That's incredible, right? But that's difficult, right? How do you translate a word that can mean 10 different things, right? Word order, Genesis 1:1, is in Hebrew is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, which is in the beginning, in the beginning created God heavens and earth. That's the word order in Hebrew. Well, in English, word order should be in the beginning God created, not created God. But in Hebrew, you put the verb first and the subject second, unless you want to emphasize something. So, do we try to stay as close to the word order of the original, or do we try to make it good English? Right? It's a difficulty, especially with Paul, because Paul writes really long sentences. Like Ephesians chapter 1, About 12 verses of Ephesians chapter 1 is one sentence. It's insane. It's insane, right? And so, like, you can't translate a sentence that's 12 verses long. You have to break that up. You can't do that in English, right? So we have to figure out a way to do that. And then gender issues. Gender issues like when Paul says adelphoi, adelphoi is the Greek word for brothers. When he says brothers, is he excluding sisters? Is he just talking to the men in the congregation? Or does adelphoi mean everybody? Right? Like, which way should we go with that?
Hey Ryan, just one, before you go to the next slide, the vocabulary thing also operates in the reverse, where there's more complexity in Greek language than in English, so that you lose the nuance when you translate it.
Sure. Well, and there are times.
You're having to figure out what that word means.
Right.
But if there are four versions of the word love in
right.
Greek that translate into only one word,
right.
you have to understand which love word you're
right. Right. Like Jesus' conversation with Peter, right? Do you love me? Do you love me? I love you. I love you. And the words are getting changed in that interaction, where it's agape phileo, right? Like that interchange is different in Greek, not in English. There are words that can't translate. There's a word in Hebrew that's my favorite word in Hebrew. It's chesed. You can't speak Hebrew unless you're spitting on people. So chesed generally gets translated as like loving kindness or something like that. But what the heck does that even mean? Right? Does anybody use loving kindness in their normal day-to-day life? Like, I sure don't. That word, it means covenantal loyalty. It means that we are in a covenant and I am fulfilling my obligations perfectly. It doesn't mean loving kindness. Like, what does that even mean, right? It means there's a relationship here that has expectations, and I am meeting those expectations. I am doing what I ought to do, right? That's what chesed means. And so when it says that the faithfulness of the Lord is forever, right? It's saying the chesed of the Lord is forever. It's saying he fulfills his obligations always into eternity, right? And so that's a word that, like, what do you even do with that in English? Like, there's just not a word for it, right? And that anybody that speaks a second language knows there's words that you can say it in this language, but you can't in this, right? It's just not possible. Yeah. So with gender issues, this used to not be as much of a problem, but about 10 years ago, there's a Greek professor that did a study with a bunch of teenagers. He had them all read a passage that had brothers in it pretty regularly, and then he asked all of the teenagers, who do you think this is written to? And the vast majority of the girls in the group said it's written to the boys. And he said, why do you think that? And they said, well, because it says brothers. That's written to them, not to us. And so then you have to start thinking, like, okay, well, if there are women who read brothers and don't think that they're included in that, but Paul intended to include them in that, should I translate adelphoi as brothers and sisters, even though it technically just means brothers? Or should I put brothers and then put a footnote and say, this means everybody, right? There's a lot of challenges here, right? Translation is difficult. So let me give you an example of translating, okay? Since I'm sure you have all been just like chomping at the bit to see some Hebrew, there's some Hebrew for you. It's a really crazy language. Really cool, I really like it, but it's also really weird in a lot of ways. So here's a direct word-for-word translation. And also, I, that's not a typo, I is repeated. And also, I gave to you, and then I'll give you three choices here, bluntness, innocence, or cleanness, gave to you that, whatever that is, of teeth in all your cities. Now, just based on that, what do you think is being given? Is it bluntness of teeth, innocence of teeth, or cleanness of teeth? So, if we go to the next part of the passage, it says, and lack of bread in all your places. So that maybe helps us a little bit. say cleanness? Yeah.
Everyone has
Cleanness, yeah. Yeah, that's probably what this is, right? Cleanness of teeth. He's saying, I gave you no food, which means your teeth are clean because you can't eat anything, right? This is just a way of saying, I didn't give you any food, so your teeth are clean, right? I gave you cleanness of teeth. And you have not turned to me, says the Lord, right? So, and also I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, lack of bread in all your places, and you have not turned to me, says the Lord. So here's some of the versions, translations for this. There's New King James. And I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities and lack of bread in all your places, yet you have not returned to me, says the Lord. This is pretty spot on, right? This is pretty much like same word order, like we're dealing with the same thing, right? If we look at ESV and New American Standard, they're pretty similar to this because the King James casts a really long shadow. And so generally speaking, translations tend to just copy the King James unless they have a really good reason not to. I've read some of the proceedings for the ESV Translation Committee, and there are times where they literally say, like in the Lord's Prayer, they argued over the Lord's Prayer. Because one of the guys said, we shouldn't say hallowed. We shouldn't say hallowed be thy name. Because no one uses hallowed. Who knows what hallowed means anymore? And you know what the other people said? They said, if we don't put hallowed in there, the people that have it memorized that way will think we got it wrong. Because people know the Lord's Prayer so well as hallowed, even if they don't know what hallowed means, they'll think we made a mistake because they know it's supposed to say hallowed. Right? So the King James casts a long shadow. Unless they have a really good reason to change it, they won't. NIV. So we get a little bit of interpretation here. I gave you empty stomachs in every city and a lack of bread in every town, yet you have not returned to me. Now see here, we have a pretty close translation, but it's interpreted cleanness of teeth for us. It said cleanness of teeth is probably too hard for you to understand, so I'm just going to tell you what that means. Even though there's no word for empty or stomach in the passage, it's going to interpret that for us. Does that make sense? So the NIV is trying to make more sense for us. NLT takes it one step further. I brought hunger to every city and famine to every town, but still you would not return to me, says the Lord. So the NLT has moved further away from a literal reading and tried to make it even more comfortable in English, right? Trying to give you the most simple and understandable reading. Give you a couple of other examples. This is the HCSB. This is my favorite translation, even though it doesn't exist anymore. Now there's just the CSB, which is not bad. It's good, but it's just not as good as the HCSB. I gave you absolutely nothing to eat, and notice there's an asterisk there, right? I give you absolutely nothing to eat in all your cities, and a shortage of food in all your communities, yet you did not return to me. This is the Lord's declaration. Now that asterisk leads you to a marginal note that says, literally, cleanness of teeth. The reason I like the HCSB is because the HCSB is going to give you as literal a translation as possible, unless the literal translation doesn't make sense. If it doesn't make sense, it will interpret that for you, but it will tell you it's interpreting it and give you the literal in the margin. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? It gives you the literal translation as best as it can, unless it thinks you need some help, right? So it's sort of like the middle of the road. And then just because it's fun, and everyone always asks, I figured I would throw the message up there. You know, don't you, that I'm the one who emptied your pantries and cleaned out your cupboards, who left you hungry and standing in bread lines, but you never got hungry for me. You continued to ignore me. God's decree. Now, this is like wildly interpretive, right? Wildly interpretive. But the artistry of this is actually, like, we can appreciate that. Because notice it doesn't say, you never got hungry for me in the text. But doesn't it seem like that's kind of what is implied? I didn't give you any food, and yet you still wouldn't turn to me, right? It's sort of implied, like, you should have had a hunger, if only for me you should have had a hunger, right? And so Eugene Peterson, who's the person who did the Message translation, I think does a good job of giving us what I would say is like the tone of the passage even if he's not giving us a good translation of the passage. My favorite example for the Message, I wouldn't use it as a study Bible, but I would use it as a resource, right? If you're struggling with the passage, see what Peterson does with the Message, because sometimes he'll say things in a way that you're like, oh. My favorite example is in Philippians. Paul says, if therefore there be any fellowship of love, any consolation of spirit, make my joy complete by being of like mind. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like you read that and you're like, huh? And in the Message it says, if you've gotten anything out of your Christian experience, do me a favor and get along with one another. Oh, okay, I get what you're saying, right? Like, if there's this, or there's this, or there's this, then do me a favor and be of like mind, right? Like, if you've gotten these things, then stop being a jerk, right? Like, it kind of makes sense, right? And so I like the Message, even though not necessarily the best translation in the world.